I'm a lifelong classicist. I've always been interested in ancient Greece and Rome, and Carthage, actually, I like to add in there with some occasional interest in the Celts and the ancient Near East. But generally, I like Greece and Rome, and of course, of the two, I like the Greeks more. I find them a lot more interesting. The Romans, I suppose, come across as more admirable. They produced more useful things, but the Greeks come across as a lot more interesting. Whenever you're introduced to the ancient Greeks, a study of them, you're inevitably introduced to the physical environment that created them. Greece is a country that's got a very jagged coastline. There's lots of islands. In the classical period, Greece also included the eastern Aegean Sea, which is now the far western part of Turkey, which is pretty much the same topography. The coastline is constantly broken by coves, bays, inlets, gulfs, this sort of thing, and there's a whole bunch of different mountain chains in Greece that break all the habitable bits up into isolated groups, or isolated rather pockets. And the civilization, the ancient Greek civilization, grew up as a series of isolated groups that developed city-states, and they developed sort of alongside each other, but as completely separate entities, totally politically independent from each other. And this, of course, fostered a spirit of competition among them, especially military competition. Warfare simply never seemed to end. There was always some war going on or other. There were constant coming and going of leagues and alliances, but nobody ever, until Alexander, was able to actually conquer the entirety of Greece. And he was only really able to do that by convincing all of Greece to unite to attack Persia. So Greece, because of its geography, because of the fact that it was cut up into all these small pieces, developed a dynamic military technology. It's funny, the ancient Greeks had a concept called banausos, which sort of said that there's no real dignity in labor. The best thing to be is a gentleman squire with his own farm, and being a scholar, a rhetorician, an athlete, or something like this. But going out there and earning a living with your hands was not considered even remotely respectable. That was either for slaves or foreigners in Athens, that is. But the exception to that disdain for the craftsman was the craftsman who produced military equipment or military innovation. Banausos pretty much ensured that there wasn't going to be a great amount of technological, agricultural, or scientific innovation throughout the entire period of the ancient world, and there wasn't really. But there was a constant improvement in military technology. They started out with simple spears and shields and helmets, and they developed eventually into gigantic siege machines, high-tech boats that were used essentially as movable battering rams, very, very advanced compared to the rest of the civilization military technology. Now, this kind of is Europe writ small. The ancient Greeks were sort of, in many ways, a microcosm of what eventually became Europe. It was also, Europe also had the crazy quilt of geography and the crazy quilt of peoples, cut off from each other by various geographical features. And of course, they were constantly fighting, and they constantly worked on and improved their military technology. They started off with the mounted knight, capapi, and they developed from there into the crossbow, the longbow, the arquebus, and firearms and this sort of thing, all the way up to today nuclear weapons and sophisticated smart weapons. As a result of constant military competition. Because of various other factors, the larger European attitude generally turned in favor of technological advancement in just about every other field. That came later than the early Indo-Europeans or the Greeks, Romans, etc. But it arrived nonetheless. There are other examples, I suppose, in the ancient world of technologically advanced civilizations that were socially lagging very far behind. My favorite example of that is my ancestors, or they may be my ancestors, I don't know, the ancient Celts. In many ways, they were savages, let's be honest. They may have practiced human sacrifice, cannibalism, headhunting, this kind of thing. In many ways, I find, studying the ancient Celts, they do seem to be a people kind of living in darkness and ruled by their priests, the Druids. But, again, that lopsidedness comes out. Their military technology was second to none in the ancient world. They invented chain mail, which eventually was used by the armies of the entire world, from the Chinese to the Persians, the Turks, the Europeans, to the Arabs of Morocco. That was invented by the Celts, or we believe that it was. Apparently the quality of their iron was better than anyone else's. And the Celts did have a very stratified society, and they did put people who worked with their hands at the bottom along with everyone else in the ancient world. But the people who worked with iron or who built weapons were actually given pride of place in their civilization and had a religiously sanctioned, respected place in their society. So same thing, and this comes out in other Indo-European peoples, such as the Hittites, who conquered most of, or a large chunk of, the Near East in their day, although they were technically superior with their chariots and their iron weapons. They apparently invented iron. And yet they were inferior to the people that they conquered, the Babylonians and the Egyptians and such other people, or maybe they didn't conquer them, but they defeated them and fought them all to a standstill. So again, you see that pattern of a warrior race that is lean, hungry, and technologically backward, taking on and overcoming civilizations that may have been actually superior to their own, but militarily inferior. The Banausos that I refer to was also prevalent in many other civilizations. In the ancient Chinese, certainly did not glorify physical labor. The ideal thing for a gentleman to do was to sit in his country house and discuss philosophy or poetry, or work on his calligraphy or his musical talents. Same thing for a Persian gentleman. War was an important part of it all, but it was an unpleasant reality. It wasn't really considered the be-all and end-all of everything. Same thing even for the Arabs in their day. They had an almost what we would almost call neurotic reverence for the written word or the recited word, but they were never great warriors, except for at the very beginning of their civilization, when they burst out of the Arabic homeland and conquered North Africa, the Middle East, and Central Asia, or parts of it. The truly great Islamic armies in history have always been non-Arabs. Usually they're Turkish or Turkic peoples. The Seljuk and Ottoman Turks are the best examples of this. But they're kind of a completely different people from the Arabs. But this is sort of the bedrock upon which the dominance of the West, I think, eventually grew out of. This constant competition between everyone that was brought along by geography and by physical isolation and geographical isolation, one state from the other, which simply didn't obtain in most other parts of the world. In Europe, nobody was ever able to impose his will on the entirety of the continent or the subcontinent of Europe. Some people did it for very short periods of time. Napoleon and Hitler come to mind. But they only did so at the cost of terrible wars and totally exhausting the continent. And even they ultimately failed. But in most other parts of the world, you would have just one big kingdom, like in China or Persia or, to a lesser extent, India and the Islamic world, where you would have a long period of more or less political stability throughout the realm, and then some upheaval where the whole thing would sort of fray at the edges and perhaps completely collapse. Then you'd have a period of civil war, and then boom, you'd have peace again for a few hundred years, and then the process would repeat itself. In Europe, it was a constant series of either minor or major wars that never seemed to end. That too is something that is unique to Europe and would act as a strong spur towards constant military innovation, which again, they may have developed to use it against each other, but as a side effect of that is the period that it really hasn't ended yet, where it was European or Western military dominance, or hegemony at least, over the entire world. Thank you.